My family stole my $90K college fund to keep up appearances. I worked 3 jobs to graduate. Now they're stalking and slandering me, but my friend exposed them in public and destroyed their reputation. I'm 26 years old. I work in digital marketing for a tech company. And honestly, I need to tell this story because my parents basically spent years controlling and destroying my financial and emotional life. And now that I finally managed to escape from them, they're trying to come back like nothing ever happened. The thing is, all of this started when I was like 17 years old, in my senior year of high school, when my parents lost their jobs almost at the same time. My dad, James Kim, was a corporate lawyer at a big firm, like one of those guys who makes good money and is always showing off their status. And my mom, Susan Kim, worked in real estate and was also doing pretty well. But it turns out my dad was fired from his firm. They never explained exactly why, although years later I found out there were issues with his performance and his attitude. And my mom lost her job because the real estate market was terrible at that time. The thing is, I didn't realize immediately how bad things were, because they kept acting like everything was normal, they kept spending money on unnecessary things, they kept keeping up appearances in front of family and friends. I was focused on my studies because I wanted to get into a good university, and I had been working super hard to get scholarships because I knew college was expensive. My paternal grandfather, Henry Kim, had set up a college savings fund for me when I was born, and my parents always told me that money was there waiting for me, that I shouldn't worry about anything, that I should just focus on getting good grades. So it came time to apply to universities, and I applied to several, including some in other states because I wanted to get out of the house a bit. Explore. You know what I mean? And I got a pretty good scholarship to a university in a nearby city. It didn't cover everything, but it covered like 60% of tuition. And I was super excited. But then came the time to make the initial payments and organize everything about housing and books and stuff, and my parents started acting weird. Every time I asked about Grandpa Henry's college fund, they changed the subject or said they were handling it, that I shouldn't worry. Until one day, I think it was like in July before I started college, my mom sat down with me and said, "Look, Hannah, we need to talk about the college money." And I thought, okay, here comes the conversation about budgets and how to manage money. Normal. But no. What she told me was that they had to use the college fund for family emergency expenses. When I say I froze, I was literally paralyzed. I asked her how much was left and she just said, "Nothing. We used it all." I don't know if you can imagine what it feels like to hear that, but it was like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water on me. That was the money my grandfather had saved for almost 18 years for my education, and they just spent it without even asking me or warning me. When I tried to talk to my dad, I just said they were difficult decisions they had to make, and that I was too young to understand the family's financial situation. I mean, basically they told me to shut up and accept that they had stolen my money, because that's what it was, a theft. Later, I found out from other family members that a large part of that money was used to maintain their lifestyle, to keep going to expensive restaurants, to buy designer clothes, to keep up appearances in front of their friends and the community. It wasn't for emergency medical expenses or anything like that. It was for their ego. So, I started college basically with nothing, with my partial scholarship and what I could save from a summer job I got at the last minute. And let me tell you, those were the hardest years of my life up to that point. I worked 2, sometimes 3 jobs while studying full-time. I worked at a coffee shop in the mornings before classes. Then I went to university. And at night and on weekends, I worked at a department store. I slept like 4 or 5 hours a night, lived basically on ramen and whatever I could get at the campus food bank. And every cent I earned went to tuition, books, or rent for a tiny room I shared with 2 other girls. And meanwhile, you know what my parents were doing? They called every week asking how everything was going, acting like they were the most concerned and loving parents in the world, but they never, and when I say never, I mean never, offered to help me financially. In fact, there were times when my mom would call me and ask to borrow money, like $50 or $100 here and there, and I was so naive that I gave it to them because I thought if I made sacrifices for them, eventually they would do the same for me. How stupid I was. Seriously. They also started becoming more and more controlling about my decisions. They wanted to know who I was going out with, what classes I was taking, where I worked, who I lived with, everything, and if I didn't respond to their messages immediately, they would start sending me exaggerated text messages like, "We're worried about you. Why aren't you answering? Don't you love us anymore? That kind of emotional manipulation. I turned 18 inches my first semester of college, and technically I was already an adult, but they kept trying to control every aspect of my life. I remember in my sophomore year, I met a guy I liked, and when I casually mentioned it to my mom on the phone, she got hysterical, saying I needed to focus on my studies and not on relationships, that men were only going to distract me and ruin my future. And my dad was worse. He called me specifically to tell me that as long as I depended on them in any way, I wasn't allowed to have a boyfriend. But wait, depend on them? If they weren't giving me absolutely anything, I was paying for everything with my work and my scholarship. So my senior year of college came and I was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, but I was also determined to graduate and get a good job, so I could finally be completely independent from them. I applied to several jobs during the last semester and got an incredible offer at a digital marketing company in another state, like 6 hours away from where my parents lived. The salary was very good, especially for someone fresh out of college, and I was super excited. But when I told my parents, thinking they would be proud, they got furious. My mom said it was a selfish decision to go so far away, that they needed me close, that family was more important than money. And my dad literally told me that if I accepted that job, I would be rejecting my family and would have to face the consequences of that decision. But you know what? By that point, I was so fed up with their manipulation that I simply told them I was going to accept the job anyway. I graduated in May, with honors by the way, and neither of my parents came to my graduation. They said they couldn't afford the trip, although my aunt told me later they had gone to Las Vegas that same weekend. So I graduated alone, well, with some college friends who had become my real family. 2 weeks later, I moved to my new state to start my job, and it was the first time in my life I felt like I could breathe. I was living in a small apartment, but it was mine. I was paying my own bills with my money, and nobody was telling me what to do or making me feel guilty for existing. The first few months were intense, because I was learning everything about my new job and adapting to living in a new city where I didn't know anyone. But honestly, it was better to be alone than to deal with the constant drama from my parents. And here comes the interesting part. After I moved, I started distancing myself from them very intentionally. I stopped responding to their calls immediately, stopped telling them details about my life, basically established boundaries for the first time in my life. And guess what? They didn't take it well at all. My mom started sending me super long and dramatic messages about how I was an ungrateful daughter, how they had sacrificed everything for me. Literally, what did they sacrifice? If they spent the money for my education on themselves, and how I was abandoning them in their time of need. But I was no longer the 7-year-old girl who felt guilty about everything. I had matured and understood that what they had done was wrong. Super wrong. So after several months of increasingly aggressive and manipulative messages, I made the decision to cut off contact completely. I sent them a final message saying I needed space and time to process everything that had happened, and that I wouldn't be available for communication for an indefinite time. And then I blocked them from everything. Phone, social media, email, everything. It was liberating and terrifying at the same time, because part of me still felt that guilt they had been cultivating in me for years, but another part of me knew it was the right thing to do. 2 years passed, 2 full years without any contact with them, and they were honestly the best years of my life up to that point. I made incredible friends at work, started going to therapy to process all the trauma from my childhood and adolescence, met a guy named Connor White who was kind and respectful and everything opposite to my parents' toxicity, and basically built a life I was proud of. I had paid off all my student loans, had savings, was considering buying my first new car. Things were going well. And then, like 6 months ago, out of nowhere, I received a message from my mom on LinkedIn, of all places, because apparently she had been looking for ways to contact me. The message said something like, "Hannah, I know we haven't talked in a long time and I respect that you needed your space, but your father and I really want to reconnect with you. We've been working on ourselves and want to share something special with you. As for you." And I just stared at that message like, really? After 2 years of silence, after everything that happened, this is how they try to come back into my life? They didn't apologize for stealing my money, didn't acknowledge their manipulative behavior. They just said they had a surprise for me, as if that erased years of emotional and financial abuse. I didn't respond immediately because I needed to think carefully about what to do, and I talked to Connor about it because by that point we had been dating for like a year and he knew the whole story. He told me to do what felt right for me, but to be careful because people like that rarely truly change. And he was right. But I think part of me still had that naive hope that maybe, just maybe, they had reflected and were genuinely sorry. After like a week, I responded, telling them I wasn't ready for a visit, but that we could start with email or short message exchanges to see how it went. But they didn't accept that. Not at all. They immediately started pushing for an in-person meeting, saying they had driven all the way to my state, which I never asked them to do, and that it would be very meaningful if we saw each other face to face. I held my ground and said no, that I didn't feel comfortable with that yet. And then the whole family circus started. Suddenly, I started receiving messages from aunts, uncles, cousins, even family friends I hadn't seen in years, all telling me basically the same thing: that I was being too hard on my parents, that they only wanted the best for me, that family is forever, blah blah blah. It was obvious my parents had activated their manipulation network and were using other people to pressure me. What angered me most was that my Aunt Grace Park, my mom's sister, called me, you don't know how she got my new number, and told me that the surprise my parents had was a trust fund they had established for me, like, to replace the money they had spent. And she also told me my parents had been in therapy for over a year working on their issues. And yeah, that sounded good in theory, but I was super skeptical, because my parents had always been good at manipulating situations and making big promises they never kept. Plus, the fact that they were using my aunt to give me this information instead of talking to me directly about the trust fund seemed super suspicious to me. I decided that if they were going to be in my life in any way, I needed to establish very clear boundaries from the start. So I sent them a long, well-thought-out email where I basically told them, look, if we want to try to rebuild a relationship, these are my rules. First, no surprise visits. Everything has to be coordinated in advance, and with my permission. Second, they won't have access to my physical address or personal information. Third, communication will be through email or messages. For now, no calls until I feel ready. Fourth, I need them to specifically acknowledge the harm they caused. Me. Not with vague words, but with concrete examples. And fifth, if they break any of these rules, I'll cut contact again and it will be permanent. The response I received was, wow. It was exactly what I expected, and at the same time, worse than I imagined. My dad responded with this super long and defensive email where he basically said I was too rigid, that I was being controlling, ironic coming from him, that they were my parents and deserved respect, and that everything they had done in the past was because I was too independent and needed more structure and discipline. I mean, they were blaming me for their abusive behavior. He said things like, I had always been difficult to handle, that I never listened to their advice, that I was ungrateful for not appreciating everything they supposedly had done for me. Not a single real apology, not a single acknowledgement of their responsibility. And then, things got weird and escalated super fast. Like a week after that email, I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize, telling me that my parents only wanted the best for me and that I was going to regret pushing them out of my life. The message had a sort of threatening tone, like implying something bad could happen to me if I didn't let my parents back into my life. I blocked that number immediately and reported the message to the police, although they told me they couldn't do much without proof of who sent it, but to keep records of everything just in case. After that, I thought maybe my parents would finally get the message and leave me alone. But no, because then I discovered they had been following me on Instagram through fake accounts. How did I realize? Because I started noticing that some accounts with random names and no profile pictures were watching all my stories. And when I looked carefully, I could see these accounts only followed people from my city and area. It was obvious they were trying to find out where I lived and what I was doing. I made my account private and blocked all suspicious accounts, but the damage was already done because apparently they had seen enough to identify my general area. And here comes the part that really scared me. One day, I arrived at my apartment after work, and the building manager told me that an older man had been there earlier, asking for me specifically, saying he was my father and wanted to give me a surprise. The manager, thank God, didn't give him information or let him go up because I had left specific instructions that no one be allowed access without my prior approval. But the fact that my dad had found my building and had tried to get in was terrifying. How did they find me? Had they hired someone to investigate me? Had they been following me? I sent my dad an immediate message telling him that if he or my mom showed up near my apartment again without my permission, I was going to call the police and report them for harassment. His response was super condescending, saying I was overreacting, that he just wanted to see me and make sure I was okay, that there was nothing wrong with a father visiting his daughter. But I wasn't playing anymore. So I responded that this was my final warning and that any unsolicited contact from that point forward would be considered legal harassment. Connor and I had been talking about moving in together anyway because our relationship was going super well, but this accelerated our plans. Within 2 weeks, we found a new apartment in a different area of the city, didn't tell anyone the exact address, and moved super discreetly. I changed my phone number again, put all my social media on ultra private, and basically became super careful about what information I shared online. It was exhausting living with that level of paranoia, but I felt it was necessary to maintain my safety and peace of mind. I thought we had finally left everything behind. But like 2 months later, my friend Lauren Davis, who lives in my hometown, sent me a message saying she had seen my parents at a community family event and had heard my mom talking to other people about me. According to Lauren, my mom was telling this completely distorted version of the story, where I was the rebellious daughter who had abandoned her parents in their time of need, that I was selfish and ungrateful, and that they had tried everything to reconnect with me, but I cruelly rejected them. Lauren knew the truth because I had told her everything years ago, and she was furious. And here comes the part that still makes me emotional. Lauren literally confronted my parents in public at that event. She told them in front of other people that she knew the truth about how they had stolen my college money, how they had forced me to work multiple jobs to pay for my education, how they had been emotionally abusive and manipulative, and how they were now harassing me after 2 years of me asking them for space. She said it was pathetic that they were playing the victim role when they had been the abusers all along. According to what Lauren told me, my parents were in total shock and didn't know what to say, and many of the people who were there started seeing them differently. Apparently, several family members and family friends started asking their own questions and realizing that maybe the version of the story my parents had been telling wasn't the complete truth. It was validating, in a way I can't even explain, because for years I had felt that no one would believe me if I told my version, but having someone publicly defending me meant the world to me. After that, I received some messages from family members who hadn't been in contact with me, some apologizing for having believed my parents' version without hearing my side, others simply expressing their support. But I also received some negative messages, especially from Daniel Kim, a distant cousin on my dad's side, who told me that no matter what had happened, I should forgive my parents, because they're family and because they're getting older and blah blah blah. I responded very directly, telling him that forgiveness doesn't mean allowing abuse to continue, and that establishing healthy boundaries isn't punishment, it's self-care. My parents tried to contact me one last time after the incident with Lauren, sending me an email where they basically said I had ruined their reputation in the community, that I was spreading lies about them, and that they would have to face the social consequences of my false accusations. They threatened to hire a lawyer to sue me for defamation. Although Lauren and I knew they had no case because everything she had said was true and could be proven with documents and testimonies, I responded to them one last time saying that if they continued contacting me or trying to locate me, I would proceed to request a formal restraining order. I attached documentation of all the harassment, including screenshots of the threatening messages, the building manager's report about my dad's visit, evidence of the fake Instagram accounts, everything. I didn't hear anything from them for several weeks and thought they had finally understood. But then I received one last message from my mom. Not threatening this time, but super manipulative and full of guilt. It said things like I was their only daughter, that they loved me despite everything, that the trust fund money was still available for me if I ever decided to give them another chance, and that they hoped someday I could find space in my heart to forgive them. It ended with, "We will always be your parents and we will always be here for you," which made me feel nauseous because after everything that had happened, they still didn't understand that the problem wasn't that I needed temporary space. It was that their behavior had been fundamentally harmful and that they couldn't just buy my forgiveness with a trust fund. I didn't respond to that message and haven't heard anything from them since then. It's been like 3 months now. And honestly, I'm okay with that. More than okay. I'm still in therapy, working through all the trauma and unhealthy thought patterns I developed as a result of growing up with manipulative and abusive parents. Connor and I are engaged now. We're getting married next year. And he's been incredibly supportive and patient with me while I process all this. I have friends who feel like real family. I have a job I love. I have financial stability that I built completely on my own. Do I miss having parents? Sometimes, I guess. But what I miss is the idea of parents, not the actual parents I have. I miss the fantasy of how things should have been, of having parents who would support me and celebrate my achievements instead of sabotaging them. But the parents I have, James and Susan Kim, aren't those people, and probably never will be. And I've reached the point where I can accept that without feeling guilty or like something is wrong with me. Last week, Connor and I were looking at houses because we want to buy our first property together, and I realized this is the life I built from scratch, without anyone's help, especially without my parents' help. And I feel proud of that. Genuinely proud. I still have difficult days where guilt tries to creep in, where I wonder if I'm a bad person for keeping them out of my life. But then I remember everything I went through, everything I overcame, and I realize that protecting my peace of mind and well-being isn't selfish, it's necessary. And that's enough for now, I guess.